I, 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 I got a letter from the government the other day. I opened and read it and burned that. Man, the way that I live don't concern that. Man, we gon' have to settle this another.
Deal drugs and use drugs at a greater rate than people of color in general and black people specifically. And when it comes to drug use, white folks are using drugs at a wildly greater rate. Really. So, I haven't even gotten to, next slide. Keep going. Keep going. How do we deal with the crisis? I have a theory. Go. I have a theory that poverty, please ask me questions if you need to. I have a theory. Poverty forces people forces many people to commit crimes. All right? When you don't have jobs, when you don't have the means to feed, clothe, and shelter yourself, if you are a survivor, and most of us are wired to survive, you're going to get that food and clothing and shelter. You're going to get it for yourself, you're going to get it for your kids, you're going to get it for the people that you're taking care of. Black women have done that. Black women have done that. And I think that these survival tactics, these crimes of poverty, they're called crimes, these crimes of poverty, these survival crimes, should be thought of as work. So, I call it criminal work. Anything that people do that's illegal to get food, clothing, and shelter. Go ahead. So, essentially, and this is historical as well, there was a time when the majority of crimes were small-scale theft crimes. People stole in order to survive. Today, people are dealing drugs. Women, disproportionately black women, are engaging in prostitution and sex work. So the tactics that people use to survive poverty, the tactics themselves are criminalized. They're made illegal, which I think is the same as making poverty itself illegal. Because if your choice is death, homelessness, starvation, or watching your loved ones die, starve, or be homeless, you might break the law. Some people do. All right, for black women, to summarize, between the 1970s and 1980s, you have jobs, especially the jobs that black people do, black men, black women, moving out of the cities, for example, out of the United States into other parts of the world, where a largely female and child labor force, so largely the jobs are moving overseas, women of color in Africa, in Latin America, and Asia, and their children are now doing the same work that black and brown people were doing here. But they're doing it for way cheaper, okay? So the jobs move overseas. In the 80s, Reagan says, basically, I'm going to put this very just generally, scares the white voters, oh, the welfare queens, the welfare queens. This is today's bad little black girl, the welfare queen, right? The crack whore, who's going to have crack babies and then make it into the suburbs to shoot up white people, right? This is the myth. It's not true. The majority of people who are using crack, and the people who are using crack at the highest rate are white. They're poor white people, right? The majority of people on welfare are white. But when people think of welfare, in general, when people think of welfare, they think black, lazy, when it's black woman, mother, just living off the taxes of hard-earning white people. Hard-working everybody, but hard-working white people specifically. So there was this demonization of welfare recipients, this demonization then of black women. Voters support the effort in Congress to cut welfare funds. They support Clinton's effort to redo the welfare system. This pushes more women and children, more people into poverty. And a fraction of those people are going to commit crimes to survive. So when you have black women in prison now, and you have them in prison at disproportionate rates, it's because they're dealing with poverty in a more severe brand of poverty than their white counterparts. Black people in general live in more severe poverty than even poor whites. And black women and black children fare even worse in poverty situations. So, to sum up, could you just go all the way to the, keep going. Okay, so to sum up, can you go back one? If we're going to have a conversation about mass incarceration that really leads us to understand how complex the system is, we have to talk about not just race, we have to talk about gender. We have to talk about, if we address the problem as we see it as one that just black males are experiencing, then we are not just ignoring but erasing the struggling, the suffering, the oppression of black women, women of color more generally. And you can't fight the system. You can't fight the system if you're only trying to help some people in that system. If you want to really go after the system, you want to take it, you want to crack it, you want to crack mass incarceration, which is produced by white supremacy, white domination of society's social, political, and economic institutions, you have to attack racism as it is connected to mass incarceration. You have to attack sexism, classism, heterosexism, right? You have to go after all the injustices. You have to look at how everybody is impacted by it. And then you can effectively fight the prison system.
That's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful information. I want you, if you have questions for our panelists at this time, please jot them down, because after we hear from each panelist, we'll have time to submit those questions to them. Thank you again, Lee. Can we give her another hand? Thank you. Our next panelist will be Aisha Fleary. Aisha Fleary is the Director of Information and Education for the All African Peoples Development and Empowerment Project, AAPDEP. She also serves as Secretary for the Black to Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations. She has presented worldwide on topics such as climate change and its impact on the African community, and in the oppression of African women, breaking through feminism. She recently returned from Sierra Leone, where she met with community members working on the AAPDEP projects there. Please help me welcome Aisha.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. So just before I start, I wanted to say that I'm going to be using the term African people to represent black people, so I just don't want there to be any confusion. And so what I was asked to talk about was militarism and imperialism and its impact on black women outside of the U.S. So that's the context of what I'm about to say. So imperialism shows its face in many ways. One of the most recognizable faces of imperialism is colonialism. Colonialism is the use of the state to exploit and oppress populations in the effort to maintain power. In the United States, imperialism shows its colonial fangs with the creation of what we call the prison industrial complex. The colonial military, or the police, agents of the state, creates many police states in poor communities of color, more specifically black communities. It is within these communities that the plan to re-enslave African people through incarceration is carried out. Because we understand the nature of colonialism and how it has been carried out against African people in this country, there should be no ignorance as to why, more often than not, the extrajudicial killings are carried out in our communities. So imperialism, the same beast that works under the guise of law and order in the United States, is not so different in other places. It works through neo-colonial regimes and economic destabilization policies of the IMF and World Bank. There's a strategic displacement of entire populations to get at resources, human or otherwise, and in those situations there are heavy military presence in the form of the police, or in some cases the army, who despite the poverty of a country always seem to be equipped with high-powered rifles and instruments of war. This, of course, is carried out in Africa, but elevated to genocidal levels through the creation of proxy wars, which kills millions in a few years, leaving lands available for foreign multinational interests. In Europe, as Africans escape the turmoil of their homeland and brave dangerous trips by sea, as they reach the shores of some European nations situations, they are either left to die in the ocean or captured and held in detention camps until they either die from unhealthy conditions or return to the situation in their home country. The situation that imperialism created, the situation that Europe and the US created. So far, I'm intentionally speaking about these contradictions in a non-gender specific way because too often corporate media picks out what is happening to African women to position them as victims against other Africans. However, I wanted to be clear that these tactics are not only happening to the women, but also to the men, boys and girls. The entire community is affected, and to be even more clear, these conditions are not symptomatic of some internal African discourse, but instead is an example of imperialism's need to dominate as a way to continue a system of capitalist exploitation of people and natural resources and destabilize communities. But it's more advantageous for corporate media to highlight gender violence, especially the rape of women, and it's more galvanizing force than, say, the call to save African people or African men even from rape. Media exploits gender violence as a proof of human rights violations and as justification for calling for military intervention. This is a tactic employed by all agents of imperialism, including charity and non-governmental organizations that claim to advocate for the rights of women. But by mentioning the attacks on the entire community, I do not want to minimize the specific oppression of African women. We've all heard about the heinous acts carried out on by so-called rebel soldiers who really are funded by imperialism and are used as instruments of war on the continent. They kill, maim, and rape droves of women. This behavior against African women usually doesn't represent itself in such epidemic proportions until there's a conflict over resources. These are behaviors that disappear when those resources and populations end up being controlled by a coalition of imperialist countries. In Rwanda, 500,000 women were raped during the 1994 genocide. After that, no women, the amount of rape wasn't happening at such epidemic proportions. And people will have you believe it's because of the military intervention, when in fact, the fact that the women were raped at such high levels was because of the imperialist interest in those areas. Up to 64,000 women were raped in Sierra Leone by armed combatants from 1991 to 2001. Again, this is a way to terrorize the community and break up and destabilize communities and make it so that these women can't be in these communities anymore. So they have to move, they have to go. And when you move and shift the community that way, it leaves those lands open for multinational interests. Because that's what rape is used for in these communities, to move and shift women and move and shift communities away from these lands. And more than half a million women have been raped in Democratic Republic of Congo in the past decade. In resource-rich Congo, we have been hearing of these atrocities for more than 60 years. King Leopold of Belgium waged a vicious attack on the population in which millions of Africans were killed or disfigured. In modern times, resources like coltan, oil, rubber, and whatever else Congo has to offer up is for grabs for the government. Governments of technology-rich countries like the U.S. and Europe, and is the reason that the Congo still remains unstable and chaotic. The reasons why the soldiers are instructed to rape. The reasons why women are victims. The backbone of community and oftentimes their presence are barriers between land and rich and natural resources and multinational corporation interests. It is these multinational corporations that lobby their governments to intervene militarily when their interests are not being satisfied. Non-governmental organizations are erected to highlight the human violation, especially around women and children, which provide an emotional tie to the imperialist exploitation and militarism. This should leave you with a better understanding as to why the plight of African women in non-resource-rich places like North America and Europe are not at the forefront. They don't want you to see it in the U.S., Europe, or in the Caribbean, because they don't want you to know that it exists. Then you can't feel sorry for those poor people in faraway lands. You have to confront the terror right here where you live. In Europe, African immigrants struggle against deportations in Frontex, a private security intelligence company funded by the European Union to act as border control for all of Europe, and carries out terroristic strategies to keep African and other immigrants out of those countries. Initially started throughout France and the United Kingdom, now expanding to the Netherlands and Germany. they move to deport from European lands or detain African immigrants, in which case they use them in much the same way they use prisoners here in the U.S. as a source of corporate capitalist exploitation through slave labor. The official position of the European Union regarding the internment camps in Africa is that they are not a part of European Union policy, which means they don't have any jurisdiction, or they don't have to answer to anybody. So Frontex basically can do whatever they want to do. It is in these places that women are also subject to gender violence. Is that my time? I'm sorry. Okay. I can sit here and rattle off numbers and statistics, but the reality is that we all know that this happens and will continue to happen until something very drastic is done. There can be no attempt to reform the military or reform colonialism or reform capitalism. The entire thing is rotten. It is not until we destroy the thing that benefits from the misery of Africans, from our poverty, from our illiteracy, from our horizontal violence or black-on-black violence. It is not until we wage a serious struggle against colonialism and push for the end of capitalism will we see the situation improve not only for African women, but for all people. You see, we can talk about, we can save a prisoner from death, or we can get one exonerated, but the reality is that there is 20 more ready to be locked up in their place. And we would become exhausted in this fight until we focus, organize, and politicize, which is very important, politicize our people and fight against imperialism.
I'm going to remind you to please jot down questions that you'll have for our panelists when we have time to do that. Our next panelist, I want her to pronounce her name quietly so I do not disrespect her. Miss Iyele Ichile is the mother of an insightful 3-year-old named Abu. She's also an assistant professor of African American Studies at Temple University in Philadelphia. Her research and teaching revolves around the themes of spirituality, political mobilizing, resistance, music, and gender among African people globally. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
All right. Hi, everybody. Hotep, welcome. I would like to first thank Sammy, the creator, ancestors, everybody who allows me to sit here and talk with you. So I'm kind of a last-minute schedule change. I didn't think initially I had much to say about mass incarceration because I hadn't really taken this scholarly look at it, and I can't claim to have been on the forefront of the development of SAMI or anything like that, but I studied things in historical perspective, and I felt like I had as much to say about it as anybody else who's affected by it, even in those indirect ways. Last year, I taught at Virginia Commonwealth University. I had an opportunity to teach African American Studies courses at Richmond City Jail. It's one of the worst correctional facilities in the state of Virginia. There are so many human rights violations going on. Those brothers in there, I just got a letter from one of them who was finally allowed to write me when he was moved to a different facility. And the reason he was transferred to this other facility was because they said he was gaining too much influence over the other inmates. And the influence wasn't to do things that we would consider negative. It's that he's a part of the education program and he reads too much. He's educating himself. And so I really thought that his words really, they resonated with me, and I thought, well, okay, if I had an impact on this one person, maybe I have something to say, so I'm here. So my contribution to this discussion of sex and sexism and mass incarceration is really from my own studies of resistance and the ways in which African men and women contribute together to organize resistance to enslavement, to colonization, to all these other things. So my talk starts way, way back. So I'm taking you guys back to the 17th century because mass incarceration begins there. It really begins in feudal Europe because many of the evil, torture, and all these other brutal penal practices were practiced on themselves first, and then they transplanted these ideas and perfected them using African people's bodies. So this slideshow is to provide you all with something else to look at other than me, also to contextualize what I'm talking about. This is our first image, and the light kind of keeps you from seeing, but this is an image from Cuba in the year 1849. This is a popular method of correction. This brother has been stripped naked pegged to the ground. He's tied to these stakes in the ground. He's being whipped. And then behind him in the background, you can see another black man in chains. He's shackled, another sister behind him with her arms also shackled behind her back. And I think this is an important picture to begin with because men have gender too. So this can't just be a woman conversation. I think people assume that when you're talking about sexism, you're talking about just women. And I think it would be a mistake for us to marginalize anyone in any conversation about issues like this, because attacks on African humanity have always sought out every possible aspect of an individual's identity and used that to punish them. And so my research here, in terms of looking at resistance, is also focusing on the ways in which the punishment and incarceration and torture of African people has also been based on gender. It's racialized, but it's also gender, right, as your speakers have already discussed. And the overall mission of these institutions of correction have been to punish black families, black leadership, and black culture. And so I really just want to start by talking a little bit about kind of the initial threat that black women posed to this system. My research focuses on the ways in which black women were political leaders during enslavement, working as co-strategists in some of our most popular rebellions. They made maroon communities last longer. You can't have a maroon community that replicates itself if you don't have women there. And then finally looking at spiritual warfare, ethnobotanical knowledge, and all these other ways in which black women fought. And then on the flip side, looking at the ways in which laws were passed, certain types of torture and punishment were meted out to specifically address the ways in which black men and women fought together. And they fought from our cultural base, which is something that brings us to an African conversation. We didn't follow the typical rules of engagement. We didn't meet everybody at 7 o'clock on the battlefield and say, okay, let's shake hands and then back up and shoot at each other. We use indigenous medicine, terrain, prayers, mediumship, whatever was at our disposal, and they found ways and tried to find methods to attack every bit of that, even poisoning, which is a big part of my research. But judicial terror, it's been called that before. I really like that phrase, judicial terror, really has us in the record, black women showing up constantly, and because of the way history is written by these white male documentarians who are Christian, all these blind spots there. And then I started to look and I wondered why every time I saw a black man at the gallows, there was a woman standing next to him about to get her neck snapped too. Well, what does she do? I always ask myself that question. That part was never written down. It was almost like there was a humiliation in admitting that there was a black woman who chopped you up with a machete and she had to die too. But then you look at the punishments. People's breasts being cut off. There was a woman in New Orleans who was tied to a lamppost and the police beat her and then stuck a firecracker in her vagina. If you look at them outlawing black women having certain types of herbs, even if it was just medicine, and then using children to punish them, that could either mean shackling you to your child by the neck and having you watch your child also chafe with an iron shackle at age 6, or separating you from your children, or locking you in a cell with your child. The gender of a person was used to punish them. And I know I'm all over the place, but follow me down this rabbit hole. But I think what's important is that the presence of women in these resistance movements indicates that these are intergenerational struggles that can happen, that they are long-term struggles that can happen, and that if you mobilize both men and women and you see them both as actors in their own liberation, you see that they can mobilize even more people. Sammy, there's no mistake why we have strong women in this organization that are participating alongside men, because that's how African people have always fought together. So, I want to just, if you could, just go to the next slide. Thank you. We can skip this one too. Oh, this one is my favorite. They actually took this off the database. This is from Saint-Domingue, which would later become Haiti. This black figure on the left being held by this French general is full of meat. It is a mannequin stitched together inside black fabric. They trained this cage full of hungry dogs. They kept them caged up and unfed for days, and then released them, allowed them to devour the black mannequin, and to train them to chase black bodies and rip them to shreds. But typically the punishment was to punish families. So you've got a husband and wife. Let's take Claire and Kobina in Suriname, who were Maroon community leaders. Their punishments were kind of different. Claire was hanged. Her husband Kobina, he was broken on a wheel, his body, his limbs, his back. But their children were also sentenced to watch their parents be tortured and executed. That was their crime for being Maroon children. And so the family has always been a part of the punishment process. Now, they're not still locking up black children today. Well, no, that's not true. We know that's not true. But you know, for the little ones that are made to that are affected by this, they witness their parents cycling through the incarceration system. When I was at the Richmond City Jail, a lot of the brothers that I was teaching in my class had been coming to that same jail since they were 4 to visit their parents. And so children are incarcerated, in a sense, on many different symbolic levels with their parents. Men have been castrated. This wasn't just something that started after slavery during lynching. Castration has always been a part of it. They have been made to wear women's clothing. I guess that was supposed to put them to some sort of shame. Again, gender becomes a part of the punishment. Women, of course, were ritually and formally raped as punishment for doing things like running away, for poisoning someone. I want to the last picture, which is, no, pull that one. Thank you. The one before that. Yes. This is the treadmill. This is the original treadmill. I know we like to think about it as a form of exercise. This is Jamaica, in a Jamaican house of corrections. Because slaveholders didn't always whip us themselves. They would send us away to get whipped elsewhere. And so these houses of corrections turned into city jails, county jails, workhouses, all these other things. So there's a genealogy of all this stuff. But you can't see it really well, but there are people on the treadmill, and if they fall, they get whipped, right? You gotta keep it moving. But at the bottom, there's a sister, and she's getting her braids cut off. Her braids. Think about that for just a second. I know I got like less than a second left, but there are all these ways in which our culture was a form of resistance, and so this is less about black women ain't still poisoning people, sadly. But I'm really trying to get us to have a conversation about what we need to restore so that if we are resisting the prison industrial complex, if we are resisting capitalism, colonialism, what is it based in? Can we restore the threat so at least if we gotta suffer in these containment spaces, it's worth something? When I was in the jail, they had all these Christian missionary types coming in there telling them they're all demons and whores. That was not empowering these people to do anything when they got out of these cells. So the cultural context has to come back. These women were getting their braids cut off because those braids meant something. They were hiding food, grains of rice in their braids, braiding maps to freedom in their hair, or simply braiding your hair and not wearing a rag meant that you had a culture before you were a captive, and you were expressing that you were a free person. And so that had to go. You went to the house of correction and your braids had to go. Right? And so culture, I think, is like that last, if we take these as like their last words to us before they went down. And a lot of them went down smiling. They would stand at the gallows and at the guillotine and smile. Crews of 16-year-old girls about to be decapitated, just smiling. Like, look, I did the damage I came to do. Right? We have to take their last words to us, their symbolic last gestures, and use that as instructions for how to make this right and move forward, and be grounded in ourselves, in anything that we do. And that's my piece.
Aren't these sisters phenomenal? Sometimes there's a quote that says we are the dream and the hope of the slave. And I know that we're the dreams and the hopes, and you guys are phenomenal. I want to do a chime check really quick, because if there's like burning things that you want to say, but we want to give the audience time to process and then pose questions to you. How much time we got? 17? We got some time, so can we open it to the audience?
Can I say something?
Real quick.
If you have questions, I did approach the stage so we can have Mike. Really quick. So, start approaching. I'm totally brainwashed. Miele's talking about, I'm glad you took it back to slavery, because there's a lot I skipped, and one of the things that I skipped and you brought up, you were talking about how missionaries coming into the present-day prison system and calling men demons, and the men and the women whores. Okay, and in the slavery period, one of the justifications used to enslave black people, enslave African people, and later African American people, was that the race was genetically promiscuous, sexually savage, couldn't stop themselves from having sex, and without slavery would rape black men, would rape every black woman in sight. But this, that was the myth, that was the lie. And white slave masters had access, free sexual access, to black women and black girls who were considered property. You can't rape property, you can't rape a chair, right? So when you force yourself as a white master, and you let your sons and the white family friends force yourself on these women and girls, you are just doing to them what they were made to be done, what they were made for. You're raping them. They were made to be raped. So black women, black girls, black females are defined essentially as whores. Fast forward to today, what's the welfare queen, right? She can't stop having sex. She keeps having kids. She's promiscuous. What's the crack whore? She's literally a whore, supposedly on crack. And I want to tie that. I'm not saying that mass incarceration is the fault. I mean, and this is very general, but mass incarceration is the fault of African American people and black people in general. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that there are ways that we perpetuate sexism and oppression in our own community. When you think about pimp culture, right, and the designating of black women and girls coming up as hoes and whores and things to be their children who are things to be penetrated sexually. And I have all kinds of, the majority of women who are going, and black women are going into the system, women in general, have been raped. They're rape survivors, they're rape victims. And their sexual trauma played a direct role, actually, in them being in the system. But what I'm saying is we need to rethink the way we talk about ourselves as gendered people, as men, as women. We need to rethink this whole, if you're a pimp, you got swag, and this is a great thing to be a pimp. And positioning black women and girls as hoes, because we're not helping. In fact, the system of mass incarceration, which I agree, prison system is fundamentally broken, is fundamentally discriminatory and violent. It is not working. It has to go, and we're helping along white supremacy in the thinking, in the pimp thinking, in the hoe thinking.
Making sure that our questions are questions and not longer statements, so we can give the panel time to exercise their expertise.
I want to thank you all for being a part of this panel. It was really great to hear all you had to say. Leanne Francis, is that your name? I just want a point of clarification of what you said earlier. You said you had a theory that poverty is related to criminalization or criminal behavior. So that's actually several macro theories that allude to that same thought. One in particular, the strain theory by Merton, which basically insinuates that if one has a certain amount of strain on them because of a lack of material access, that they are likely to engage in crime. So I just wanted a point of clarification, because there are theories that will kind of almost place the blame on impoverished people and say that's why they're committing crime, instead of criminalizing the state, who is fostering and manufacturing an atmosphere for criminalization. So I just wanted that point of clarification.
Sure, and that was that's not my theory. My theory is actually that what the powers that be, what white authorities call crime, what people call crimes, some of those crimes are actually work. That's my theory. That drug dealing is work. And I mean, clearly, not only is it work, but it's a billion-dollar industry when it's white folks running the pharmaceutical companies. And white folks providing, mostly white folks with the Valium and Prozac and the Klonopin and all that. So I'm saying that the drug dealing, just like sex work, there's a theory that prostitution is work. I'm saying that drug dealing is one example of work. I would actually go as far as to say, even though theft arguably hurts people, I'm saying that if what you're doing is what you do to survive the poverty, and you do it over and over and over again, my theory is that you're working. That's my theory. And it's meant to actually, what I want to do is reconceptualize the way, re-envision the way people think of work, okay? And I am putting the blame on the state, and I should have said what both folks, and Aisha said first so brilliantly, capitalism is the problem. Right? But when you try to talk to people, because you can't have capitalism is going to stop working without poverty. Right? You need to have poor people and people doing these low-wage jobs to make capitalism work. But if you try to convince people to actually give up their goods, give up that Mercedes and Lexus and the clothes and Macy's and I have a vanity too. You try to convince folks to give that stuff up and share? Okay. Thank you.
My name's Armani. Just wondering if any of y'all, I was wondering about the struggle of Black women internationally, looking at like Black women in, say, entering Israel and are being euthanized, like Sudanese refugees, and wondering how you connect that struggle, or what you guys think about that struggle of Black women internationally.
Well, we're talking about a global system of capitalism, colonialism. It wasn't just something that's U.S. based. So if you go to, Black women going to, or African women going to Israel, we're talking about a white supremacist white supremacist state that demonizes anybody, particularly African people. So it doesn't matter whether we're from here or from Africa or from the Caribbean, they don't want you there in the first place. And they will do anything they possibly can to make sure that you won't have no babies. And so it's a part of that. I mean, it's all connected. And the reason why the term I use African, the term generally, because I want people to understand that we're the same people. African, so-called American, African, so-called Caribbean, African from Ghana, Africans from, we're the same Black people wherever we are. So it don't matter. So they're connected in that struggle, in that same vein, that we are carrying a legacy. I don't want to call it a legacy, but we're carrying a history of colonialism and enslavement. It didn't just happen to us on the west side. It happened on the continent of Africa. It happens on the continent. Those ancestors that were enslaved were the ancestors of the people who are still in Africa. And so these are the things that are carried throughout our life and our history, and it's a shared history. So even if we have people who come from the continent that go to to Israel that gets euthanized, that's our struggle. You know that African people, African women suffer the highest rates of infant and mortality death in the world. In the world. Don't matter if you live here, we die the most, our babies die the most. Don't matter if you live on the continent of Africa, we die the most, our babies die the most. No matter if we're in Europe, we die the most, our babies die the most. And it doesn't matter the fact that we live in a so-called developed or undeveloped country, because the cultural experience that we experience, our historical aspect, the colonialism, the system that continues to oppress us is the same the world over. So,
yeah, I really appreciate your question, and I'm so glad that I'm on the panel with these sisters. Aisha brought up the international component, and I think, and I hope, I know there are elements within SAME that are having this conversation in other organizations, but I think we've got to create a language to bridge these struggles across continents because they are the same. So, what's happening up here with your average dope boy in, Southeast DC, with cocaine and, the whole crack thing, can we have a language or build bridges to have a conversation about what's happening with Afro-Colombians who are getting their butts kicked over this whole cocaine issue in South America before it gets here? You know what I mean? Like, that drug itself is hurting Africans on either end of the American, continent. And so I think the language has to be a Pan-African language. It has to be something that bridges those conversations. The rape of women in the Congo and the strategic rape of African women in places like Colombia, the mass displacement of African people. We're everywhere in the world being moved here, moved there, like just being shoved by all these various forces. Gentrification, I mean, it's all the same thing. We just have to create the language and stop and kind of get out of this United States limit. Stop and frisk, right? We have the stop and frisk movement. There are organizations among continental Africans in France who are going through the same thing, only instead of asking you, are you carrying something, they say, do you have your papers? It's the same exact phenomenon. So I think that conversation, I mean, of course it should happen for African women, black women globally, but I think it's a conversation that really should talk about human rights, the way African people define humanity and human rights for themselves, and demand that for both men and women.
Just anything to add, but here in the U.S., the majority of women who are going into prison, disproportionately black, are rape victims, rape survivors, and when they get to prison, many of them will be raped again. And who's raping them? It's white male guards. The majority of the rapists are white male guards. So the sexual terrorism is global. It is. It looks like a lot of different things.
So she said,
Yes.
okay, so you said something about drugs and that being an occupation, a job, and it's work. And the thing is that when we tend to think about the mass rape of women in different places around the world, we don't think of that as being somebody's job, but that's somebody's job, you know, because these soldiers are being paid and instructed to rape as an instrument of war. And so if rape paid here, more so than drugs, then we would be the target of rape here as well. But so that I think that we need to really understand that as
Okay, what we're going to do is take this last question and pose that to the panel, and that is going to conclude our discussion. They've been wonderful. Just clap up again real quick. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Asantua Imprimature, and my question is for Dr. Francis. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I read something a few years ago about there are particular type of industries in prisons, particularly women's prisons, where they're paid a very low wage. And I was wondering if you knew anything about that, because the article I read a few years ago was about a lot of us sisters like to wear Victoria's Secret. You know, we pay $50 for a bra, but we don't have our mammogram, and yet in the prison they're paid less than $1 a day to make a Victoria's Secret bra that we pay $50 for out here on the outside. So, but I mean, do you know any other industry in prison? Sure. Thank you.
We got a few more minutes, y'all.
I don't know them all, and ELA it sounds like ELA can add, but AT&T and MCI make multiple millions of dollars overcharging imprisoned people, period, including the women. $5 a minute to make a call home when they're making imprisoned people, period. And the women are going to be making less. They're making no more than $1 a day, so somewhere between 50 cents and $1 a day. They're also they have to pay for their own health care. But companies like Victoria's Secret, McDonald's, Walmart, Westinghouse, you said Dell Computers, Boeing, and you know you can even go online if these private prison companies. They're like hotels. They only make money when they're full. So you could go online, any one of us, and invest in that. Isn't that great? And I'm going to bring it back to the education piece. What they call education in the private prisons and in the public prisons too is the Bible education. I'm not knocking the Bible, but when you are teaching people that you're teaching people that they are not only sinners. You're not teaching people anything that's going to get them a job. Okay? People have faith going in. African Americans in general, Christian people, they have faith going in. Okay? They have faith. They need their faith. They need the faith. But the faith is going to have, I hope I'm not saying anything terrible, but stay in power. People can eat, get jobs, get educations, be more than functionally illiterate, which most prison people are. But that is bigger than the question of asking.
Yeah, there are lots of lists on the internet, but interestingly enough, in not even necessarily on the low, the list grows every day. So there's always new corporations getting in on the slavery piece. And there was a professor at Howard in the education department that did a study a while back. Some of you may know his name. I forget it, sorry. But he looked at, Atlanta public schools and how they extrapolate the numbers of new jail beds to build based on the third grade reading scores of black males.
So why are our schools so bad?
Because it's a pipeline, and you all know this thing. But
People are making billions.
But they're making money. But the thing is, it's always been profitable, and I think that goes back to slavery. Black people were held in these jails, these workhouses, while their slaveholders negotiated prices.
And after slavery.
And after slavery, yeah, over in the convict leasing system. These places have been spaces to maximize profit off of black people just by simply holding them in one place. And they create almost like this inside third world economy where we got black women earning $1 a day, as the sister said, making the same wages as a black woman in another part of the world. And then they come out and they also are not able to earn much more than that in the outside world. And military equipment. And so that, so again, if it doesn't paint that picture for you, then we know that our struggles are the same. Our living conditions are the same, so that conversation has to kind of break down those borders of these so-called nation states.
We were added a few more minutes, and so this young lady's going to pose a question to us. What's the grant?
I actually have 2 questions.
So
I wanted to know if the panel could talk about how the gendering of African people is also an instrument of imperialism and capitalism and white supremacy in the world, because it definitely creates this polarization between African men and women, which is not something that we culturally did. It's not something that we culturally identified with. And then my second question is, I wanted to know if you could talk about the spiritual implications behind this kind of sexual warfare that is going on against African people, because that's the grounding of our cultural context anyway, spirituality. So why these people feel the need to attack us in that way really affects us on a spiritual level. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
yeah, I mean, this is the blueprint. This is the playbook of colonialism. Oh, my bad. Okay. You should go first. Okay, so when I was doing my dissertation, my advisor was like, this dissertation is supposed to be about women. It's about men as much as about women. What the heck? I was like, well, this is not about black women being censored and marginalizing black men at the same time. That's not us. That's not how we do. That's not. And so I was like, okay, we can talk about complementarity. We can talk about how if we follow our spiritual teaching, we follow our indigenous ways of being, then there will always be black men and women doing things together. Maybe not even always the same things, but power is an equally shared thing, an equally respected thing. And that was the major threat. Now, the reason why we have these combative relationships today is because we look at each other. A pimp is a black man looking at a black woman through a white man's eyes, right? And so we're not ourselves. We've adopted bad behavior and bad character that was really imposed on us. And I tried to allude to this when I was talking about the male maroons. When they were captured, they made them parade around in women's clothing as if that was going to humiliate them, or they did so-called women's work and that would humiliate them. But they were like, look. This is not a form of humiliation because my deity is a feminine deity, and I put on these women's clothes when I'm in my ritual over there. What's new? I can do that because I'm in harmony with my gender thing. I'm both. I can be both. I can go in and out. I'm a man, but I respect women enough to be like, okay, well, I guess I'm this right now. So I think that we have to again get back to our own definitions and our own concept of relations of things. And so. And I think also with the judicial thing, the reason why they attacked us spiritually and why the Christian religion has been used and wielded in the name of slavery and colonization is because we use our spirituality to attack them. Right. And it's really just that. And that's why all these laws, the laws don't look the same anymore, but it's no mistake that the churches go in, and it's not necessarily coming from this old black Christian liberation theology thing that we assume is happening in the prisons. This is Black social control through eliminating possibilities of other spiritual beliefs coming in. Like when I was talking to the brothers, they asked me to come back voluntarily over the summer and do more talks about African spirituality. We could have had that whole entire class of 30 Black men practicing some kind of African belief system because it resonated with them. It was very, and you know, you have the 5% nation that's on the rise in the prisons. It's not by mistake. They're just seeking an alternative. And now that's also being called a terrorist organization.
Oh yeah.
I had to take some terrorism training class when I got my job. They said it's a terrorist organization. But again, if you look at like the witch craze, my research goes back to Salem and how Black women were considered to be witches on a level that white women weren't. There were no white women who were burned here. They were burned in Europe, but they weren't burned here because burning someone alive because they were in league with Satan was reserved specifically for Black people. We were naturally thought to be in league with Satan from birth because we were African. Satan lived in our curls. There was Christian hair, which was straight, and curled hair, which was hair of Satan. Now, this is the language, this vocabulary. So we have to look at the vocabulary and then change the vocabulary, right? And so, 87% of Black women who were executed for these crimes, these resistant crimes of dealing with spirituality, dealing with murder, dealing with resistance, 87% of the women executed in the state of Virginia between 1632 and 1879 were Black women. They were killing their own property. This was not profitable for them, but it was based on a deep fear of African cultural practices. And a lot of this, again, was gendered, but it had to do with what happens when Black men are going to get themselves together. It was all about separating Black families. So that is the conversation we have to have with Chris Rock and everybody else who says we're natural enemies. Like, hey, have we been ourselves lately?
How about that?
To answer your question, yes, I think, as I was saying it when you were there, yes. The creation of genders within the African community, I think, is definitely a major part of imperialism, white power. When we talk about the women's movement and how this was, how they adopted anti-slavery movement of the early, back when it was happening, abolition, that we had these white women who were sitting at home talking about, we want to work. We want to be next to these, our men in the, at the job. When we have people, they have African women who've been workers, who have been right next to their partners in the fields, giving life to their white babies through breast milk, have been used as a tool. And so these are the things that, this was a reality for Black people in general. There was no separation between a Black male worker and a white and a Black female worker. You did the same job. There was no concessions for you. You didn't get a chance to rest out underneath the shade. And so there's that thing that we were both the same. And it wasn't until you had that induction into this women's movement that now took you out of that framework of you are a part of this system. And the thing that you have to fight is not white power, which means white women too, but it means that you have to fight Black men or men in general, and then grouping Black men, which had less power than white women, into that category. And so now you have this attack that you have people trying to frame Black women and making them say that men in general are bad, when in fact the least powerful man in this country is the Black man. And so when you're starting to separate them out and pull, African women into some separate position. And I understand that there's sexism and there's misogyny and everything within our culture. But when you start to really start to divide along those lines and saying that, Black women or, we have these gender issues and all these other types of things, and now you have this war, this thing that happens between Black women and Black men that's antagonistic. And so it's a distraction, and you cannot fight a thing that's oppressing you both.
That's right.
And so we have these arguments and we have these movements about these rights of Black women or women in general, and we have these things, and this whole discussion is that happen. But the most unifying thing for African people is to struggle against their oppression. And you saw that all the time. When you're fighting through slavery, when you're fighting through colonialism, all that gender mess goes out the window when you have to focus on your enemy. And that's the thing that's going to wipe that all out.
Thank you all for presenting today. My name is Sade Anderson. I'm a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin. I feel bad now to ask my question about specifics, and not in any way to be divisive. I just think it's important because we always hear about what black men endure in the prisons. I was going to ask you all to speak to the specifics of what black women endure in terms, I'm thinking of the shackle when in Cali, right? And it's actually potentially on the table in Maryland. But the lack of medical care, what women have to endure during pregnancy behind bars, birth control as a form of violence. So if you all could speak to that.
All right, so I said that the majority of women who are entering, who are forced into the prison system are have been raped, have been beaten by husbands and boyfriends. There's another conversation that I think needs to be had. I don't think we're going to be able to have it here because I'm not sharing this information in order to fracture or split apart our communities along gender lines. My personal belief is that just like in your own family, you have to face how you're hurting each other so that you can stop doing that in order to focus on the bigger enemy, the real enemy, if you will. Stop fighting each other. And we can't do that. We can't do that unless, in my belief, we have a conversation about how, for example, men hurt women, and women hurt men, women hurt children, and men hurt children, how black folks quarreling and falling out over who we choose to love. It's interesting to me that there's a time when black men were humiliated by being forced into what Europeans or whites thought of as women's dress. Today, that would have been, my God, if a black man, any man, but if a black man were asked to put on quote unquote women's, this would be drama. So I want to look at that stuff so we can heal it and focus on the real problem. All right, so to respond to the question. So the majority of women are sexual violence, rape survivors, domestic violence survivors, incest survivors, some kind of sexual violence. The statistics are not really available on this, but at least 30% are mental illness. There's a high rate of mental illness among the women and men too. The women are in their early to mid 30s. They're most likely to have been convicted of a drug-related offense. Their families are torn apart, just like under slavery. So capitalism, in the way it looks today, is still tearing black families apart. Once a mother is in the system, and the majority, over 60% are mothers. 60% of incarcerated black females are mothers. So once they've been there a year, they lose their children. They completely lose them to foster care. They no longer have custodial rights. These are typically people, the majority have serious substance abuse problems. Now, why are they abusing drugs, right? Not talking about smoking weed, but abusing, hurting yourself with heroin and crack. Why? Because when you're on the outside, you're poor, and you don't have access to quality health care, when you can't get medicine that you need or therapy that you need, and you're alienated from indigenous forms of mental health care, the herbs and stuff that's natural, you don't know that stuff, you're going to turn to the drugs to cope with the stresses of poverty. So most are unmarried mothers of minor children. Nearly 30% of the women are receiving public assistance before they're arrested, compared to 8% of the men. So 30% are on welfare compared to 8% of the men. And about 30% of the women had incomes that are less than $600 a month, compared to 28% of the men. That's still very close. I feel like there is one more thing I want to share with you, but it's gone. I hope that was...
I thought about this when she was talking about the people in the Sudan. I was speculating about the sterilization because obviously we've heard of medical apartheid and the sterilization projects, and we talk about the alienation of black women from their children once they're incarcerated, the alienation of black children from their fathers when their fathers are incarcerated, children who are taken into the criminal justice system prematurely because it's all about, again, the destruction of these families. It's always the destruction of families. It's not just individuals. And I think just looking at it from these perspectives and seeing how women have been kind of pushed away, women and children have been separated from each other through these systems. You know, it seems really deliberate. And I just, oh, it is. But I mean, but again, it's like, and thinking even about Asada's story is almost like, to me, with her experience of having her child in prison, she had like the STD. I mean, her story reaches back and reaches forward at the same time. It's the common experience of enslaved women in jail. Just like we said, 60% of women have children who are incarcerated. Those
Just real quick, because it's relevant. And when they give birth, they're shackled when they give birth.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. They just passed
The shackle rule, and they're thinking about doing it in Maryland, right here. Yeah, and so this idea of being incarcerated with your baby, being shackled while you're having your natural processes, I mean, again, it's got a long historical legacy. Obviously, the playbook hasn't changed very much. The blueprint for how to contain Black families, destroy them, has not changed very much at all. These draconian measures are still here, and we're getting new ones, right? And so we either keep them from having children in the first place, or we impair their children and traumatize them from day one.
Just in order to respect the 2 minutes that we have left, the young sister has a quick question, and that question is going to shape the last seconds that our panelists have. So come here, come on, don't get shy now, come on.
Hi, my name is Kirby. I came from Brooklyn, New York. So no matter where you go, I really can't jump. But no, what I wanted to say, and then the question that I wanted to ask, I'll make it real quick because I know we have a time issue. One of the things that all three of you brought up was just the sexuality of like the Black woman. And I can't remember her name, but the Black woman who was taken from Africa, brought to Europe, was put on a strip museum. Right. And how like her body was cut up and then put in a museum and returned back to Africa. And how like her body, the corset was based off of her body, right? And the conditioning that goes into like the mind of our people about what we look like, and women about how we should look, and how it's being attacked for centuries, you know what I mean? Or even the whole idea of like, how can we sit here and love ourselves when we were always taught to hate ourselves and that we were nothing? And so my question is, because we're divided, we can be here and we can say all these things, but there's things that hold us apart from each other. And that's not natural, you understand? And so my whole thing is, my question is, how do we fight against the conditioning and really fight? And not just academia, not just, you know, reading a book. How do we fight back from centuries and millennia of mental oppression? That's awesome. Thank you.
All right. So the discussion is like that. The sister right here was talking about need to happen, and they need to happen not in areas like this, but they need to happen in your hood. They need to happen in your families. Medallions. You were just African, you know, back in the 90s, and so my identity was always like, you're beautiful. You're a Black girl, and I'm just like, yeah, you have these things that you go through because you live in a colonized society where you're told you have these images about what's beauty and what isn't. But these conversations in our families, in our hoods, but between our friends need to happen because all this stuff from outside is going to tell you otherwise. And I think that when we go back to wherever we are, that we just begin those conversations or continue those conversations. When you see a little Black girl, a little Black baby girl, you tell her how beautiful she is, how beautiful her skin is, how beautiful his skin is, how nappy his hair is, and that's good Black hair. You know what I mean? These are the type of things that need to happen, and we have to continue. And not just the little Black girls, we all shades. We just say how beautiful we are as people, and our differences and our sameness, and these conversations need to happen.
Y'all know I've been talking too much. Sorry. No, but I think the question is really, really important. I think first we can start these conversations in our communities, which I think is an important point, by really taking inventory and taking stock of what we already have going on. The fact that Black women are now the most increasingly incarcerated population is not by mistake. I think they felt like they neutralized Black men so somehow these Black women and babies are still going on, like families are still happening, people still moving forward. Like that's something, that's a starting place. kid, you got your brother's locked down. You still here. You're still here. We have the nerve to survive. Like that's a starting place. But then take inventory of what we have at our disposal. Healing modalities. What makes you? What do you have? What is your culture? You know, like ask a group of high school kids, what does it mean to be a person who's African today? You know, you can, and then get at people's vocabulary. Don't call them princesses and all that other stuff. Really use new language with people and try to get them to see themselves with new eyes, or really old ones. And I think, and you know, and the brothers too. Get them re-grounded in ways in which to conduct themselves, speak with people, care for people, and teach them that they're also nurturers. We might be all right, you know. Yeah.
Okay, how do we fight back is a big question, and I know you're addressing that in this conference. So general themes to everybody else's important points. Educate yourself, feed your mind, feed your mind, feed your mind, get the facts. People can't dispute the facts. They cannot dispute the facts. And then you take that knowledge you shared with others, educate others, embrace. I think it's very important to embrace the ethic of justice for one requires justice for all. You cannot liberate yourself climbing on somebody else's back. You leave no one behind. And that requires you. It means that you have to have an open mind. You have to be open to the fact that you may have some prejudices that need to be re-examined, and you need to purge yourself of those prejudices. You got to keep an open mind. The other thing is you have to be open. In order to have an open mind, you have to be open to conversation. So, white supremacy internalized, we got self-esteem issues. It can be hard to admit you're wrong. You don't want to be wrong, you want to be defensive, you want to fight. We got to stop and listen. We're sisters and brothers in talking, stop and listen. Attack oppression at an institutional level. So there's a time to talk, and then there's a time to fight. Too much talking isn't good enough, right? You got to go after the system, and you take it apart bit by bit. And we'll get it done.
You know, I felt like I have this theory that she had touched on that, you know, when we have to redefine a term, redefine what our families now look like. We have a large majority of our population, our male populations in prison, and people talk about, oh, she got 5 baby fathers and 6 babies. That's the new African family. So I need to understand that. She ain't no good rat. She trying to survive. She trying to make y'all survive. You know what I mean? So I think that around our community as it looks like now, because these terms that we are allowing to happen to us is not accurate, and we shouldn't demonize our women for having babies and continuing us as a people.